Castor oil around the eyes has been talked about for years. Dry eye, lash growth, inflammation, floaters, cataract. People have claims for everything. But now DMSO is also entering the conversation too, and that's where I think we need to slow down for a minute, because eyeballs are not the place to get creative without understanding what you're doing. And I'm sure, like me, you want to know whether this has any teeth. So let's chat. All right, castor oil near the eyes is a nuanced conversation at best. DMSO near the eyes is historically where I stopped the car, took the keys out, and asked everyone what exactly we thought we were doing. But rather than shutting this down as dangerous anecdotal riskiness, I dove deep into any research I could find to try and prove two things. The first is whether castor oil and DMSO application in the eyes showed any true measurable benefits, and second, whether they were safe and what were the potential complications. All right, first, we're starting with castor oil. Things get a little more interesting here because unlike a lot of internet remedies that are basically held together by Facebook comments and someone's aunt swearing it changed her life, there's actually some ophthalmologic research here. Ophthalmology? Whatever. But before anyone gets too excited, let me be clear. That does not mean random castor oil from a bottle and carefully formulated ophthalmic products are interchangeable, because they are not. In a study by Gotu and colleagues, researchers looked at low concentration homogenized castor oil eye drops in patients with meibomian gland dysfunction, which is a very common contributor to dry eye because they're responsible for oil production behind the lash line. But what they found was actually pretty interesting. Patients had improvement in symptoms and better tear film stability. Other ophthalmic studies looking at castor oil containing drops have also shown improvements in the lipid layer of the tear film, which may help reduce evaporation and improve dry eye symptoms. And this is not because castor oil is oily. Castor oil is rich in something called ricinoleic acid, which makes up the vast majority of its fatty acid content. And researchers believe that this is what gives castor oil some of its unique properties. Ricinoleic acid appears to have anti-inflammatory effects. It may influence certain inflammatory signaling pathways, and it may also help support the oily tear film layer that keeps moisture from evaporating too quickly. So there may actually be plausible physiologic reason why some people with dry eye or meibomian gland dysfunction notice benefit. This is not necessarily just internet folklore and wishful thinking. Now, researchers have also looked at castor oil applied around the eyelids, particularly in people with blepharitis, which is inflammation of the eyelid margins. It's right here, or here. I'll put it up here somewhere. But with this, some patients showed improvement in symptoms and lid margin findings after several weeks. But let me just say this very clearly, because this is where people start blurring lines. Eyelids are not eyeballs. They are two very different conversations. Putting something around the eyelid margin is not the same as dropping something directly onto the ocular surface. And I think people online sometimes act like those things are interchangeable when really they're not. Now, this is also where the internet, I say the internet, with any comment section on YouTube, in a DMSO video, you're going to see somebody bring up its use in the eye. Now, this is also where the internet tends to take a perfectly reasonable piece of science and launches it directly into outer space, because once castor oil started being talked about for dry eye and lid support, suddenly the claims were a little more ambitious. People started talking about cataracts dissolving, floaters disappearing, glaucoma reversing, vision dramatically improving, eye color changing, you name it. Basically, castor oil entered its magical wizard era, and this is where I really need to pump the brakes a little bit, just a little bit. I have not seen adequate human evidence showing castor oil dissolves cataracts, reverses glaucoma, changes any of it. any of it. And I have firsthand experience with this because I've been applying castor oil to my lids and lashes for probably almost 2 years now, and some of it inevitably gets in my eyes, and I just had cataract surgery last month. So yeah, it's just not where the evidence lives right now. But castor oil, at least in certain carefully studied settings, has some actual ophthalmic research behind it. That doesn't make every claim true though, and it certainly doesn't mean every bottle belongs anywhere near your eyes. But it's a more nuanced conversation than people realize. DMSO, however, is where things get a little more complex. All right, now, DMSO is really interesting because unlike castor oil, this is not just an oil that people started experimenting with. DMSO, or dimethyl sulfoxide, has actually been studied in medicine for decades because of some very unusual properties. It's a powerful solvent, it penetrates tissues extremely well, and it can carry other substances along with it. And that's exactly why people get intrigued by it. But it's also exactly why people get really nervous about using it near the eyes as well. That would be me. I would be those people that get nervous about using it around the eyes. And to be fair, this is also where many of the supporters of DMSO get really excited, because on paper, it checks a lot of boxes that sound very attractive when we're talking about eye disease. DMSO has demonstrated anti-inflammatory effects in some settings. It appears to have free radical scavenging properties, and researchers have explored it as a drug delivery vehicle because of its ability to transport substances across biological membranes. So when people hear those things together, it's not hard to understand why interest develops. The challenge, of course, is that a plausible mechanism and proven clinical benefit are not necessarily synonymous, and that distinction becomes really important as we move forward. So when I started digging into the research, I found that DMSO has actually been studied in ophthalmology, which surprised me a little bit because historically, this is where I tended to check out. But in one ocular inflammation study, researchers looked at several different concentrations of DMSO and found something kind of important. Concentration mattered enormously. I mean, enormously. At 100% and 90% concentrations, DMSO actually aggravated inflammation. At 70 and 50%, the response was more similar to controls, but at around 30%, researchers saw some anti-inflammatory effects. And that's a huge point because it tells us right away that this is not if a little is good, more must be better kind of conversation. In fact, with DMSO, concentration appears to change the biological response in very meaningful ways. And that kind of thinking could get you into trouble quickly if you don't understand what you're dealing with. And part of why DMSO behaves this way may come down to its general mechanism of action. DMSO appears to have anti-inflammatory and free radical scavenging properties, and some researchers believe it may help reduce oxidative stress and inflammatory damage in certain tissues. And this is also where the conversation starts expanding beyond dry eye. Many of the advocates of DMSO point toward conditions like glaucoma, macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, retinal edema, and other neurovascular type eye diseases. The reasoning is fairly straightforward. Many of these conditions involve inflammation, oxidative stress, vascular dysfunction, or accumulation of metabolic waste products in the eye. So when people see a compound that appears to have all of this anti-inflammatory activity and other abilities, they naturally start wondering whether it might have broader applications. The problem is that a theory, I mean, even a reasonable theory, isn't the same as strong clinical evidence, and that's where a lot of the enthusiasm tends to get ahead of the science. But the very same property that makes DMSO intriguing is also what makes it potentially risky near delicate tissues like the eyes. Because unlike castor oil, DMSO doesn't just sit there and lubricate. It penetrates, it carries, it interacts, and ironically, that may be both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The very property that makes DMSO interesting from a medical perspective is the same property that makes people cautious about using it around the eyes. Because if DMSO can transport substances through biological tissues, then purity matters, concentration matters, sterility matters, contamination matters, eye makeup matters, skincare products matter, preservatives matter. Things that might be relatively unimportant with a simple lubricant suddenly become part of the conversation when you're talking about a compound known for carrying other substances along for the ride. A carefully studied medical formulation in a controlled setting is a completely different conversation than somebody ordering a bottle online and deciding to freestyle chemistry near their corneas. People talk about all sorts of things. Like I said, cataracts dissolving, all sorts of miracles, floaters vanishing, vision restoring, eye pressure dropping, scar tissue disappearing. Basically, DMSO enters its own magical wizard era too. But when you actually go looking for strong human evidence supporting a lot of those dramatic claims, it gets much murkier very quickly. There may be some interesting research in specific medical settings. Yes, I will totally admit that. There are also clinicians and integrative ophthalmologists who report seeing benefits in practice and are actively studying these approaches. That's still very different from saying do-it-yourself DMSO in the eye is broadly proven, universally safe, or something I'd casually recommend people experiment with. So, where do I land on DMSO in the eyes? Well, honestly, with a lot more of a cautious mindset than I have with castor oil. Not because the molecule itself is inherently evil, but because eyes are delicate. They are. DMSO behaves differently, and this is one area where understanding concentration and purity, actual research matters a whole lot more than anecdotal internet enthusiasm. Eyeballs and vision are just too precious to play around with. So, if I had to summarize this in plain English, castor oil and DMSO are not interchangeable, and they are definitely not in the same risk category when it comes to eye use. Castor oil has some legitimate ophthalmic research behind it in very specific settings, particularly around dry eye, meibomian gland dysfunction, and certain lid-related issues. And there may actually be some plausible reasons why it helps in those situations. But even then, formulation matters, sterility matters, and where you're applying it matters. Around the eyelids is one conversation. Directly into the eyes, completely different conversation. And random internet claims about cataracts dissolving and eyeballs transforming into magical high-def camera lenses, that's a conversation that I'm not seeing strong evidence for.
Really any evidence for.
DMSO, on the other hand, this isn't a sore shoulder. This is your cornea and your tear film, your ocular surface, and tissues that don't appreciate getting experimented with. And I think that's really it's really where I land on this whole conversation. I'm not dismissing every single thing that people say just because it sounds unconventional, because clearly there is some interesting research here, but I also think there's a big difference between carefully studied formulations in medical settings and do-it-yourself internet experimentation that gets way ahead of the evidence. And that distinction matters because vision is precious. Eyes are delicate, and unlike a sore elbow or dry skin, this is not an area where I think people should casually wing it because a comment section got a little overzealous. Sometimes science supports nuance, and sometimes anecdotes outrun reality, and sometimes we just need to slow down and take a breath. So if you found this video helpful, there are now over 400 videos here on Lucid Med covering chronic illness, neuropathy, medications, natural therapies, nursing insight, all kinds of health topics that I think you'll find useful. And if you'd like to go a little deeper, you can head over to lucidmedhub.com, where you'll find mini guides, additional resources, and the option to book a one-on-one health guidance call with me. And before you go, a very special thank you to my channel members. Your support helps me keep researching and building this weird little corner of YouTube where we can talk about health in a way that's balanced and hopefully a little less ridiculous than the internet sometimes makes it out to be. I appreciate you more than you know. And as always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Stay healthy and lucid.